10, he sends out the disciples, and then we're kind of in the midst here of like, oh, this is what it's like to be people sent by the king who's been revealed in a world that is not fully buying into him being the king revealed.
Yeah, and it gets a bit testy in these.
So I mean, I think it absolutely. I think it's just a very real and authentic reflection of the range of responses that you get to the king who is invading. Like, Jesus is the king. He's bringing his kingdom, invading an earth that's, here, getting on with its business.
Yeah.
A lot of the earth isn't sitting around saying, hey, we want a saviour.
Yeah.
It's not saying we want a new way of doing things. But he comes anyway, boom, and at the end of chapter 10, Jesus says this, which is a verse I must admit I've not heard. I myself have not preached on much. I don't think I've heard it preached on very much. Jesus says, I've not come to bring peace. What?
Yeah.
But a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. And what he really is saying here, we saw it in Mark, he's bringing a separation. And this is really significant because this is what we see happen when the kingdom is present. Not everyone, I think you've used the phrase before, perfect love is in our midst and not everyone jumps up and down and receives it. When the kingdom comes, it kind of exposes the range of responses that people have. Now, instantly, we should think about this. If we've been a Christian a very long time, we should instantly think, I get discouraged if other people don't seem to want to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
But that actually isn't a biblical perspective. There's never a sense that Jesus discouraged because people don't want to follow him. In fact, he's almost like, hey guys, I've come and a lot of you will not follow me, but some will.
Yeah.
So it's just, this is how it is.
Yeah. We've used the word rich before, and as I was looking at these chapters, I thought, gosh, this is rich. There's a lot going on here. You've got parables, you've got miracles, you've got John the Baptist floating around, you've got the confrontational passages, you've got Jesus saying he's gentle and lowly, and it's like so much going on. And again, it's another reason I like the way that we do it. Another advantage is you get a day just to pull on one chapter. But as we have read through these, Tom, has there been any kind of way that you've hold these bits together?
Yeah, so I think the main theme that we should think of here is you could have a very simple image which gives an idea, and then a slightly more sophisticated way of thinking about it. The basic idea is, if there's a plate of food on the table, and you dropped like a whole slab of bread onto it, like, it would respond, and the peas would do this, and the chips would do that, and like what we're seeing in these chapters is the response to God coming to earth, and people respond in lots of different ways. Maybe a different way to think about it, which maybe gives a slightly more sophisticated picture, is Band of Brothers. It's a book by a guy called Stephen Ambrose about the Easy Company of 101st Airborne, an American group of soldiers who are involved with the Second World War. It shows them through training, and then they land in Europe and their activities in Europe, and it takes it through to when Japan surrenders. So it's a fascinating book, and it's been made into a HBO miniseries, which I think is one of the highest rated miniseries.
Spielberg? Was it Spielberg? Yeah.
Well, it's 9 point something on IMDb. It's brilliant. I've watched it several times. Now, in this book, you find a particular moment where Eindhoven, the Dutch town, is being liberated by Easy Company. So they are marching or moving across Europe, across territory that's been owned and settled and run by the Germans, the Nazi soldiers. And they come into Eindhoven as a town, and as they come in, they don't know what's going to be the reception that they get. And they find that there's orange flags being waved everywhere, there's cheering. If you've seen it, you know this scene. They come in and they're like, wow, these guys, they're coming with their guns, ready to deal with me. And it's just party.
Yeah.
And people are running up to them, kissing on the cheeks and like celebrating, and there's all this stuff. And it's a liberating force coming into a previously occupied town.
Mm-hmm.
But what is fascinating is in the midst of this, there's some people who are being surrounded and shouted at, and they've even got like scissors that they're cutting all their hair off, and the Easy Company are like, what's going on here? And say, oh, these were the guys who were conspiring with the Germans, who kind of collaborated with them, and they slept with the German soldiers, or they worked with them as spies. And it's a moment where this new reality is invading. And what you find is that the allegiance that people gave is exposed. Mm-hmm. And so for some, Easy Company coming into Eindhoven is the best news that they've had for their whole life. Yeah. But for others, it's the worst news they've had their whole life. Yeah. And so Jesus comes in to this earth, and for some, that is the best news they could possibly have ever... they never imagined it could be so good. There's a Syrophoenician woman who gets to not only eat the crumbs from under the table, but have full healing. There's crowds who get fed. Yeah. There's sick who get healed. Yeah. There's people who are desperate for hope, and Jesus speaks hope. There's people who are like smouldering wicks, and he won't put them out. He's gentle and lowly. There's incredible good news to them. Yeah. But for others, it's horrible news. It's the last thing they wanted, and that's the Pharisees, and that's people from his own town who won't believe in him, even though he does miracles. And he tells some parables to illustrate that.
It does kind of shatter our naive hope that if Jesus came, everybody would absolutely love it. Yeah. And also that his teaching will always be something that I want to hear. Yeah. There's some tough teaching in here, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think, so just personally for me, I've probably shifted in the last few years from thinking that I inhabit something that is a majority belief and community. The idea that Christianity is really great news, and actually if people only understood who Jesus was, they'd love him and want him. And so therefore that to what people might call a minority mindset, which is I understand that what I believe and see and know about God is not going to appeal to a mass of people. And it just shifts how you think about things. And Jesus, just so that we get the sort of the full weight of what he's saying and doing. Like if you read through these chapters, chapter 11 to 15, every single chapter, repeatedly, he is basically saying, people will reject me. They aren't going to take this. And he's not like, oh, people are going to reject. He's like, no. In fact, do you know the interesting thing is, it's not the people are rejecting Jesus. It's Jesus rejecting them. And so the parables that he tells are, he says, if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, so if you don't accept this, you will never be forgiven. Okay, so there's an initial response of the person saying, I don't really accept Jesus. But what Jesus is saying, that's not the big deal. The big deal isn't whether you think you're a Christian anymore. The big deal is that if you don't accept Jesus, God says you will not be forgiven. Yeah. And the parables that he tells, he says, like there's a tree, you're like a tree that bears fruit, and God's a gardener. And if the fruit you bear isn't fruit God wants, he'll cut you down. Yeah. And he talks about the weeds, like sow wheat in a field, and then some weeds grow up. Now the crucial thing about this is that in Israel, in Jesus' time, the weeds that grew and the corn would look identical for many months in the harvest. And you look around and think, there's lots of people here who look exactly like they're Christians, look exactly like they follow Jesus, but when it comes to it, they don't bear fruit to God. And that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is that therefore God rips them out and throws them into the fiery furnace, and there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's what. So the key thing that Jesus is saying is not you making a decision about God. The key thing he's saying is it's God making a decision about you. Wow. That's what he's getting at here. And so the parable of the net, which is probably one of the hardest for us in our culture to hear, is that God is a fisherman. He pulls you, little fishy, out of his net. And we used to have this in our kids' baby pub when they're little. and you pull out, is it a good fish or is it a stinky fish? And if it's a stinky fish, he throws it back.
Yeah.
So the whole thing here is that God will make a call on your life. That's the big thing.
Yeah.
Not what you decide. Do you believe in Jesus or not? Do you like him? What? The big thing is God will decide, does he choose you or not?
And there's obviously a big element to that of just Jesus revealing truth.
Yeah.
This is just how it is. Do you think he's trying to... Is that all it is? He's just revealing this is what it is, or is he trying to provoke a response in the hearers? Is he? What should my emotional response be to this to this revelation of how things are?
So when I did theology at uni, they used to talk about the prophecies of the Old Testament. Would they call them 11th hour prophecies or 12th hour prophecies? Now, 12th hour prophecy is like, well, this is just what it is. So,
right.
The 12th hour prophecy would be, Brexit has brought financial challenge to the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a prophecy that it's happened.
Yeah.
You can't do anything about it. An 11th hour prophecy would be, if we continue with our treatment of the planet like it is, global warming will come to such an extent that will destroy our entire planet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people would argue maybe we're at a 12th hour.
Sure,
prophecy already. But the idea, Jesus comes in and he simultaneously, I think, brings both an 11th hour prophecy and a 12th hour prophecy. So he comes in and he says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Like if others had seen the miracles done in you, they would have repented. It's going to be better for them on the day of judgment than it would be for you." Now, why is he saying that to them? He's saying that to them so that they repent, so that they start to accept him. Right? And so that others hearing Jesus say this can look on and think, hold on a minute, what am I doing with the miracles that Jesus has done for me?
Yeah.
So there's an 11th hour aspect to it, but there's also a 12th hour aspect to it, because what Jesus sees is that people don't often change their response.
Okay.
So, for example, Herod is a king who's set his stall at being against a new king being imposed. So he kills John the Baptist.
Yeah.
And so there's like a sense that Jesus is saying, okay, it hasn't happened yet, but effectively we already know, Herod, you're going to be one of the bad stinky fish.
Yeah.
You're showing yourself, that's who you are. You are a bad tree bearing bad fruit.
Yeah.
And so Jesus comes and to you, he gives an appeal. He gives an appeal.
Yeah.
But he knows that for lots of people, they've already shown their cards that they've got in their hand. They won't turn.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's almost at a certain point, I don't know if exasperation's the right word. I'm thinking of the part where Jesus is speaking. He says, "Look, John the Baptist came and played a funeral dirge. He went hard and heavy.
Yeah.
I've come and it's like a wedding song, and you're still not dancing.
Yeah.
It's like whatever approach we would take to you.
Yeah. Your
response is already clear.
Yeah, that's it. And so I think, for us today, as we look at this, like there's part of this is it's really important that we accept Jesus as Jesus is. And there's a revelation of who Jesus is, isn't it? But I think the main thing that I would want to say here is that we are probably people living in Eindhoven, as it were, who are getting a message that God is going to come into this town. He's going to invade. And something that people talk about a lot in our day, which would not have been relevant in Jesus' day, is that we've got such a sort of secular view of the world that we just can't imagine God coming to this earth. And so they call it disenchanted. We just believe what is in front of us is in front of us, and we haven't got a concept of what it'd be like for God to come and be here. And so these scriptures are for us our instruction, our kind of declaration. God has come and is coming to this earth. Like the Easy Company are at the brink of the town. They're on their way in, and something of them is already present, but they are going to come in. will you respond? And there's a philosopher called Philip Gould who talked about, he used to do with seminary students, like people who in the US are training to be church leaders. He said he'd be really surprised that a lot of them lived saying, I believe in God, but they wouldn't live like he would imagine Jesus wanted them to live. All kinds of things they were doing. And he would start his year, every year, with going through the philosophical arguments for that kind of have been used historically to show there probably is a God. And he said these are so strong that in nearly every single case, anybody who's coming into his class with a slight uncertainty about whether the biblical God really is the true God, like oh yeah, he is the God, he is God, they're nearly always convinced. But he says what he found so fascinating is even when they're convinced of that, he would watch them for the next 6 months and there would be basically no change in their behaviour. He's like, why is this? Like, how can somebody be utterly convinced that there's a God and yet in no way change their life to reflect the fact there's a God? And what he talks about is the disenchanted living, which is we think there is a God, but we don't think that that God is going to interact, is going to watch me, is going to treat me differently depending on how I behave, is going to interact with my life, is changing what happens in history. It's like he's pulling all the strings over all of... We don't think of God like that. So we have this idea that there's a God out there, but he's not going to come into our town.
Okay.
He's not going to invade and change how things are. We don't need to make things ready for his approach because he's not going to approach. And I think that is the biggest challenge for us in the Western church at this time. And I can recognise that in my life, and I recognise that in our church.
So what are kind of some of the symptoms? I mean, as you're talking, I don't know why, I remember a conversation with a guy at school many years ago, and I think I'd maybe been an RE lesson or something like that, and he just made the statement, when you die, they put you in the ground, they bury you, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's disenchanted, isn't it? That's like...
I mean, that's full disenchantment.
Yeah.
But the impact of disenchantment that I guess I'm trying to get at here is you think when you die you're going to go to heaven to be with God. But right now, today, whether or not you believe in God does not make much difference to what you fear, what you care about, your ambitions, how you think things occur, like you kind of the equations that you run in your head of how you make progress, how you advance, what's good, what's bad. It's not affected by God being present.
It's like we live in this bubble on the earth, and
where and so you live in Eindhoven and you kind of just do what you need to do to get by. You're not kind of getting your flags out ready for the Easy Company. You're not pushing away any hint whatsoever of Nazi presence, like refusing in any way to collaborate with them. You're not kind of sending secret messages out to get. You're not doing any of that. You're not building people into understanding that a whole new reality is going to come into our town. You just live.
Yeah, just accept the status quo. Yeah.
Just go do your job, earn a bit of money, like. Okay, the Nazis need me to salute Heil Hitler, I'll do that, fine, whatever. Yeah. And that's what the problem is with what Philip Gould says is the problem with the Western church. So the things that we're doing that is maybe look at the non-Western church, because Africa and Asia and South America, they're pretty amazing at this. Like they live a day as if God is going to intervene. Like when they pray a prayer, it will make a difference. Like prayer isn't just me being changed. Prayer is circumstances being changed. They cultivate honesty and integrity and truthfulness because they believe that God will see them do that and reward them for that. Do you see what I mean? It's this kind of stuff.
And you spoke about it, I think, in the last episode or the one before with Leslie. This idea of in this room, it's not just you and me.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of spiritual forces and different things. That's enchantment, isn't it? The recognising that.
Yeah.
Angelic beings and spiritual things are amongst us.
And so, I think Peter's walking on the water is right at the centre of this section for us. And it's a brilliant tool to help us think what this might mean for us then. Because Peter is a guy who is seeking to follow Jesus. And he's sort of setting himself out on this thing that Jesus did. He's like, I'm for him. I want to be wheat, not weed. I want to turn to follow you.
And sorry, just to interrupt, I suppose the context, it comes just after the beheading of John the Baptist, isn't it? Which is like, could have been a real moment of disenchantment, couldn't it? It's like, oh, there's this guy, a fiery guy, speaking God's message, got power on him, people are coming out, maybe the Allies are on their way.
Yeah.
And then Herod, bosh, head off. So murky, isn't it? All the circumstances around the death. And John's disciples, they just go and tell Jesus, like, this is it. So from a moment of real disenchantment.
That's right. And so what does Peter do? It's a storm. Now storms historically refer to the surging of the powers of this dark age against the reality of God invading.
That's another like disenchantment, enchantment. Like, how do you reflect on the weather? Like,
yes,
it rained today, and I just think, oh, it rained.
Yeah.
Whereas many believers be, oh, this is a gift of God. It's a blessing.
Yeah.
It's a different way of looking at it, isn't it?
It's totally that. And once you start down this road, you start realising, oh my goodness,
I'm a secularist.
I am. So Peter's like, what does he do? He's sat in a boat. He's just heard that Herod's beaten this new kingdom movement. If he's not beaten it, he's pretty much beaten it. But at the same time, it's like, hold on a minute, Jesus has just literally fed thousands of people. So this is really sort of this moment. He's sat in a boat. He's like had this moment of jubilation, but then a storm rises, and once again, like fear. Once again, the sense that no, God isn't invading. Evil is still present, it's still going to win, like still discouraged, still depressed, still like, what do I do? And he sees in the midst of this storm a figure coming who is Jesus. And I love Peter in this moment. I think this is like the most amazing and inspiring moment for anybody who says, I want to be a follower of Jesus. Because what does he do? He's like, if it's you, then enchant me by, as I take a risk, you prove that there's a new reality that's present in this world. So the kingdom comes and miracles become normal, and the subduing of storms is what happens. So, the storm's happening, but the kingdom has come to such an extent that the storm has no impact upon Peter, and even more than that, that the kind of standard rules of nature don't have impact on Peter. He's got his heavenly body, effectively, where you can walk through walls and all this kind of stuff. So he says, like, enchant me. And Jesus says, okay, step out. And he steps onto the water and he takes a few steps. And then it says he looks around, he sees the winds and the waves, and his eyes are taken onto the disenchanting reality of, hold on, I'm in a world that feels like the bad guys win. Feels like God's will is God really sovereign here? Is he really doing what? Is this really a new way of living? And so he starts to sink. But Jesus doesn't condemn him. Jesus calls him, look at me, grab him, and says, just keep your eyes on me. I think it's a brilliant illustration for us of what it is to be enchanted. Is ultimately it's the life of prayer.
Okay.
Prayer that leads to risk of living a way that isn't disenchanted. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And Jesus says this over and over again. Like, he's like, I've come to bring you rest. Wear my yoke. Like, I won't snuff out a smouldering wick. But what he's saying here is like, Jesus, is the route to this kingdom life, this enchanted life, this kind of way of life which is filled with new reality and new possibility. And so the life of prayer becomes the fundamental thing that enables disciples to navigate this murky territory. Like, we live in a time where there's wheat and weed alongside one another, where there's the nets being brought in and we are up against stinky fish and clean fish, and there's all this stuff going on, and it's the life of prayer that fuels a life that walks on the water in the midst of the storm rather than sinks into the ground. And so it's what Jesus says, like, take my yoke upon you, it's easy and light. Like, look at me, come to me, I am the road. And so that is a life of prayer. And that's what I think the call is of this passage for us.
So if somebody sat there kind of and maybe recognises, I think I'm quite disenchanted actually, and maybe feeling spiritually quite dry, and the memories of the miracles are becoming a bit dim and distant. But I want to be enchanted. Like, how can I step into that more? What's the kind of practicalities of the way of Jesus? Or I don't know. I mean, we kind of, maybe it's a sign of our disenchantment. We always want to make it about the 3 steps sort of thing. But
well, yeah, I mean, there isn't. So just on that, there's 2 standard answers to that question that we see over and over again playing out in church history. The first answer to that is pretend. That sounds a bit crude, doesn't it? But over and over again, I will meet people who basically say, speak things as if that are not as if they were.
Okay.
Like, kind of, the way to it is you pretend like that you are already there, and then you become there. Now, there's actually some wisdom in that, but ultimately, what that does is it's. I was saying this to a guy yesterday I was chatting to, like, what I don't understand is if you believe that if I just have enough faith and I speak it out, then nothing bad will happen to me, how do you actually get through one day, let alone a year? But seriously, like, we have, as pastors, you realise that you go through a week and somebody, a good, faithful believer, will have something that happens to them, whether it's a tragic death, maybe it's a major illness, maybe it's like a relationship that just won't resolve. Like, you can pretend that life all works really nicely if you're but it has to be pretense. And I don't understand. I think what happens is you get more and more detached from reality, and actually often you find that people are like that. I'm not very good at relationships, because the only way you can pretend that everything is God is if you just sit in a room and pray on your own with God all the time, and you don't ever interact with other people. Now, the other answer to that is that you just say, well, head down, get on with it, like life in the trenches.
Sort of stoic, just acceptance.
Yeah, like, don't really expect that God's going to do things right now. It's going to happen in the future. Don't expect it right now. And I want to say both of those are disenchanted, actually. Now, what we're saying is this earth, this reality, where people die that you don't want them to die, where people are sick you don't want them to be sick, where you are surrounded by Herods and by the Pharisees and by towns that are the closest to Jesus, who should know him most and won't listen to him. In this, God is invading. And so you begin by not step 1, step 2, step 3, but a life of prayer where you look, like Peter in the boat, you look at Jesus and you ask him something that is, if it's you, then tell me to do this. So it's prayer becomes the impulse to action. Now, if your prayers are all, would you please be kind to Andy? Would you? That's not. We should pray all kinds of prayers. But the kind of prayer that changes things is where you're like, God, would you please use me to bring comfort to Andy? Like the really meaningful comfort that changes him. Like, if it's you, God, would you use me to speak a word that is so powerful to my mother that she becomes a changed person? Yeah. And so you begin, and not only do you say these things to God, but then you hear what God says back to you. Say, no, now's not the right time, but do this instead. Or, yes, come on then, let's do that. And so you, like Peter and Jesus, he says if it's you, but he doesn't just amen and get out the boat. He hears Jesus speak back to him, and he keeps his eyes on him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what kind of prayers are you praying, I guess? Are you praying prayers that you expect Jesus then to tell you what you do to see this prayer coming into action?